Hi, cybersecurity class. This is Professor Opterbeck, just touching base with you at the start of this new week. I can't believe we're already flying into week 4 of the semester. As usual, things are moving way too fast. But this is good. We're moving ahead. And I was really interested to see your discussions last week. It seemed like the vast majority of you really didn't have any problem at all with the US having transferred the IANA function to ICANN. And in fact, it seemed like many of you thought that was a good idea. And that certainly is consistent with the overall view of the internet law community, both in the US and internationally. Certainly the internet law community, to the extent we can use a word like that, but people who are interested in these things broadly thought it was not a good idea for the US to be retaining control of that function, and that it was good that the function was transferred to a body that's seen as a more neutral body. Although, as many of you noted, I think correctly, it remains a California nonprofit corporation, and therefore it remains subject, at least to some degree, to US legal jurisdiction. It has to be formed somewhere. It's going to be subject to jurisdiction somewhere. So at least to that very limited extent, it remains subject to some degree of control in the US. I have to be honest, I generally would hesitate to align myself with some of the policies, especially concerning international trade and the like, with some of the people who were promoting or who were concerned very much about the control of the IANA function, some of the things that I gave you to read. But I did sort of agree with them at the time, and to some extent, I think I still do. I guess I feel a little bit ambivalent about it. I'm steeped enough in the internet law scholarly community to understand and appreciate all of those concerns. But I think I'm enough of a realist to know that the internet is indeed a strategic global resource. And if you go on next semester and take the national security portion of this class, we'll dig into that even more. So I'm not entirely convinced that ICANN is really a sort of transparent and accountable organization. It certainly isn't a democratically accountable organization. There is, of course, the governmental oversight body, but there's sort of a limited degree of influence there. So I am a little bit concerned about it. I noticed that a number of you thought, well, it's just domain names. It's really not that big of a deal. And in a sense, you're right. It's not the core functionality of the internet. It's not something like search and seizure law. But do remember that this is the way that people find each other. This is the way, at least to some extent, this is the way that search operates. It's a really important function. And if this function were to collapse, it really could cause significant disruption in the internet. So it is important. So count me sympathetic to the transfer. And as many of you observed, there doesn't seem to have been any yet kind of major hiccup in the functioning of the internet. But also count me a little bit skeptical and realist. So this week we move into the question of contracts online. And I want you to get a little bit of a feel for the logic of how this is flowing. We've talked in very broad strokes about internet governance. We have noted that really sort of it's very distributed, it's very technological, a lot of it is based on code. The one function where there is sort of a kind of governance in a harder sense is this domain name function, and we've seen how that is kind of decentralized, out of government control. So we see how a lot of these ideals are not all that different from the ideals of Barlow, which we have also obviously spent a good deal of time talking about. Maybe a little more realistic than Barlow, but the idea that this moves out of government space into a kind of bottom-up governance by individuals and individual communities. And that is actually very consistent with what we talk about this week, which is the idea that what really governs is agreements between people. So the law that really matters in many ways is contract law, because contract law is the way that the law enforces agreements between people. I mean, if two people or two groups enter into some kind of agreement and that agreement is breached, What's the recourse? Well, we don't want the recourse, of course, to be violence. We don't want to say, you broke that agreement, now you better either pay up or we're going to, burn down your village, so to speak. We want there to be a legal recourse, which is through contract law. But that's very much a libertarian kind of neoconservative sort of view of the way the world works. Markets and contracts will really take care of a lot of these problems. And so part of what you want to do in the broad sense, when we're looking at some of these specific doctrines and we're looking at click-wrap agreements and all that sort of thing, but you really want to ask, do we want contracts to function with that degree of sort of power? Or is that, if we think of American constitutional law terms, is that a kind of Lochnerism? Is this a way of saying, wait a minute, you can force an agreement, or if you're in a strong bargaining position, in a sense, force an agreement on whatever you want, and the weaker party really has to accept it regardless of the broader consequences for health and welfare. And that's why I wanted you to focus on these really interesting cases that have recently come up about arbitration agreements in terms of service. And that's why we're discussing that Uber case in our discussion forum this week. Because that's a place where many contract law scholars and other people push back against this libertarian vision and say, wait, you can't have an arbitration agreement that effectively then moves the enforcement of contracts out of a really accountable legal domain into some other kind of domain. That's the kind of broad meta question for governance and the internet that I want you to think about this week, in addition to just getting under your belts some relatively straightforward doctrine about how contracts are enforced in cyberspace. So have a great week, and I'll see you online.